Hi, my name is Christopher Dennis, and I'm doing same-sex attracted people as my vulnerable population. So there's many concerns. There's suicide. They're 4 times more likely to commit suicide. There's fear, which causes them to hide and they don't come out, so they have to just remain like not who they are and just not practice what they believe. There's bullying from peers. Physical health, there's violence where they can be attacked physically. Uh, HIV risk, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and communicable disease, and STI risk. Sexual harassment and abuse, they're much more likely to experience that. Poverty, like when race and gender comes into play, poverty is exponential in those areas. And drug use, it's hard to cope in situations that aren't, conducive to a healthy environment. And so they use drugs to cope and alcohol. Um, the main media tends to show gay men as flamboyant or sometimes feminine, and lesbian women often get depicted as hypersexualized or having butch characteristics, such as looking like men. And when that isn't always the case, like it's just very stereotypical and one-dimensional as it goes on. Many medias can produce like show them as deviants or like sexual predators, and people can just get a misconception that all LGBTQ are sexual predators, and that can, lead people to be afraid, like for their children, so they'll discriminate against others because of that. Well, of course, like it's improved over the years, but people of color are very much misrepresented or underrepresented in these areas. Family support, they experience health disparities at a larger scale than the general population, and it manifests in many ways, and family support is one of the best ways to help prevent many of those hardships. But unfortunately, it comes at a price, or it doesn't come easy. Like religion, politics, lifestyle, acceptance, and sometimes even just inner beliefs get in the way, and it just causes hard because rejection can lead to many poor health outcomes. Like we already talked about, their suicide risk is 4 times more likely. We'll talk more about their homelessness, but and abuse. Like it just without a lack of family support and healthy support systems, usually comes with poor health outcomes. Positive peer support can happen, which is protection, acceptance, and expression in sexual identity is promoted. But of course, like negative peer support also happens where bullying is common, as they'll target gender and identity, where they'll target gay men for not being real men, or they'll target lesbian women for not being girly enough, and it just leads to, those stereotypes just lead to bad outcomes. Sexual harassment, as maybe they'll expect like sexual favors or like they'll use them as sexual objects, um, and that's just terrible. And so yeah, that just and rape occurs as well. Um, Physical and emotional violence just goes apart with also sexual harassment, as like people will get hurt. Um, and like sometimes like it'll just be straight up violence where people will get hit and or just like told like they're not worth anything, that they're sinners or deviants, and that they don't like have a right to exist, or like their lifestyle is terrible, and that just causes trauma. Cyclical nature, depression. Depression leads to self-harm. Self-harm leads to suicide. A suicide of one person makes it way more likely that more people around them will commit suicide. Trauma begets trauma, and they just all feed into each other, and they can go back and forth. Physical health, you have STIs and sex education. 1 in every 6 gay or bisexual men will be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime. And that's because a lot of times sex education comes from a heterosexual view, and a lot of people will view condoms as just avoiding to have babies when condoms are a good barrier to protect against STIs. Abuse, emotional, sexual, and physical are all still there. Homelessness is just a like once you're homeless, it's very hard to be stable. And people, when they're not stable, they go through risky behaviors which can lead to abuse as they put themselves in bad situations. And there's addiction, and addiction always causes, well, maybe not always, but it causes situations that can lead you to be vulnerable and can lead to homelessness if you um, aren't careful. Active policies currently exist that hurt the LGBTQ community, like the Don't Say Gay bill, which this one was in Louisiana, and basically just made so educators couldn't talk about same-sex attracted people to their students. And yeah, it just makes them more underrepresented, and people will have more misconceptions about them as if they're taboo. Their minority status, There's laws that limit same-sex couples or marriage so they don't get the benefits. There's bigotry. Representation in the legal system is small because they're a minority. It's a heterosexual dominant place, and so that just makes it hard for them to break through that barrier. And there's a lack of control. Like when you're not the one making the laws, or you're not the one that really controls like your destiny, and other people do, it's just hard to feel in control. And international views on same-sex attraction, some people just outlaw it, and it's not depicted or even talked about. Potential barriers, stigma and bigotry. You have the perceptions of public, which can be like, though, like maybe like they're pedophiles or those sexual deviants. And if people don't perceive you as a good person, then they'll treat you poorly. And that can stop you from doing a lot of things or thriving. Trauma begets trauma, and people sometimes may be implicit or explicit about it, but there's aggressions that micro and macro that hurt the community. Violence, physical violence. People will sometimes just attack them to maybe like scare them, or just to physically harm them so that they, feel like to put them in their place. And that's just really hard because they didn't do anything wrong. It's just someone doesn't accept their way of life. Mental health. When you're struggling mentally, it's hard to, get everything else in order, and it just leads your risk for suicide and other factors. Homelessness is a huge barrier. It just creates instability, and you can't find a sustainable, if you can't find a place to live, then, it's just not sustainable. Lack of resources. Many times they live in poor areas and poverty, and a lot of activism sometimes doesn't reach them. And especially if you're in like an international like part where it's third world, it may never reach her. You might not even know it exists. Sexual harassment and abuse, they're more likely to experience that as like people sexually objectify them. And education, just the lack of education, it goes from like a heterosexual view, not a view that they can really respect or understand sometimes. Um, because it just they it's not for them. They have a different view on life and a different perspective, which is good. International scope, homosexuality is criminalized in many countries and states, and it could be up to the death penalty if you get caught. So it's a good reason why some people don't come out, because they could die for it. And that's really sad. Many become asylum seekers to maybe get out of that situation to escape state violence. And if you're accepted, that's great. If you're not, then you're left to like fend for yourself. And that's where the lack of resources and social support come in. There, like if you're not accepted as an asylum seeker, sometimes you're just left for, just whatever you can do. Representation is more limited, especially in those countries that criminalize it. Fear and stigma based on the religion that's prominent there, or belief systems. They can be driven out or even killed. If people like, if rumors or things spread about like your same-sex attractedness, it can just, yeah, it can be very bad. And misconceptions also go into fear and stigma, where people will just have unrealistic expectations, or just uh not treat you well because of just how you sexually identify, and how you like and who you're attracted to. Homelessness estimates that 40% or more of homeless youth are LGBTQ, and the population is around 5% um, nationally. So that just is a huge disparity. Um, uh, yeah, and when you're homeless, it's just finding financial stability is can be unattainable. Job and coworker discrimination, this can go from like sexual harassment to having unexpected like barriers, like maybe like sexual favors or abuse. People may not be able to express themselves freely, and they might want them to dress or act a certain way, like within gender roles, and that can be just very difficult to climb the ladder when you're facing that. Um, Climb the corporate ladder. Drug abuse and addiction. This affects job stability, also homelessness. Mental health and drug abuse and addiction go hand in hand. Income, it tends to occur in areas that have poverty, and it just further stigmatizes them. And a fun fact I learned is that nurses actually have one of the most harshest views on addiction than other healthcare workers, and that's where this study was found. It was interesting that nurses just have they also face negative stigma or they also hold negative views about addiction, and that can make treatment and healthcare difficult. Poverty, they're just vulnerable to that. Lack of protection with laws, not recognizing their benefits or marriage, or maybe not recognizing discrimination as the laws can be vague. Less quality in healthcare too, as people may hold beliefs and they don't treat them well because of that. You have systemic root issues of racism, and race is just a huge fact as African Americans can be seen as brutish or animalistic, and this can just play into role with the LGBT community as gay people are seen more like animalistic and not really human. Um, Racism is just an inescapable and exponentially more harmful uh, interaction with the LGBT community, as you know, both stereotypes combine together, and people will use both of their things they can't control against them. And like with pain medication, like they'll get unequal treatment, as we've seen in studies. There's income disparities, and income is a huge factor in determining where you're going to be in life. STI risk is higher in race and ethnicity communities as they're poor and they tend to have less educational opportunities, or they don't have educational opportunities. Gender, many times like their symptoms or healthcare can be attributed to things that aren't necessary, like hormones or like PMS, or periods. Um, Government, primarily male representation, and sometimes it attacks female reproductive rights. Um, Income disparities with the gender pay gap, and that just increases homelessness, and it's hard to make ends meet. Internationally, it's dominated by men. Men are mostly found as the leaders, and women can be legally viewed as inferiors, and they sometimes have sexual like exploitations to just please men. Gay males can be seen as weak, and just more stereotypes just makes it hard when it comes to your gender. Um, Many religions disparage or do not accept LGBTQ people or their lifestyles, or are just anti-gay marriage. Um, Religions that promote anti-gay propaganda leads to violence and fear, and people will hide and they won't come out. Barriers to religious views, they can provide like less assistance or subconsciously in the business, healthcare, and community setting. Well, people will just like naturally avoid them or have distrust for them. Maybe due to like they view them as like perverted or they have sins, and yeah, and support can just be taken away once someone comes out. Um, Crime and poverty are just and location are just they're all linked. So when someone lives in a poor area, crime tends to follow. And it just is hard to get out of that when if you're already homeless, then like what do you can't really get out of it. But there's a large number of victims that report hate crimes, but a lot of hate crimes go uncharged, which means that the discrepancy is that a lot of times they're just not being protected, and hate crimes just go uh, uncharged. And poor food and water quality and resources, just lack of sanitary conditions can occur, very often occur. Telehealth is very good because it can actually help provide them with like safer environments to where they can contact the healthcare providers, also just be able to reach them, and it can help them like contact people to get resources to help them. Bias implicit, there's fear, misconceptions, insecurities, and trust issues that people can have that they maybe not fully understand, but it's just from media to just stigma. Explicit, violent, and abuse, like maybe they're sinners or they're bad people, so they deserve it. Like you're gay, so you deserve HIV because this is what like this is your lifestyle, or it's just a phase, like it's a choice, which it's not. That's just how they're attracted. And then you have your internet. Oh, that's references. Then you have your international scope, like it's illegal in many countries, so people are just pushed more into hiding, and that leads to poor conditions where like they can either go homeless or they have to like stay in places that aren't desirable because they don't want to escape state violence. They have even less resources and protections from crime, as most resources are based in the first world. And so if you're third world, you may never see them. Sex education, STI protection disparities, less coverage in media, religious fervor that can be very dangerous if it's against you, and race and gender play a role. They play a very big role in the international community. It can be much worse for you as less support is available. And then here are my references. Thank you so much for listening, guys.